Welcome back to the next video in the event From Mourning to Light. I'm your host, Sadie Bale, and I have with me a very, very interesting expert speaker. Her name is Judith Johnson. She has a PhD. She has two, actually, but she says her academic accolades are not as important as the other things she wants to talk about. She is a mentor, she's an author, and she's an educator. So Judith, welcome to From Mourning to Light.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so you've written quite a number of books, but what we really want to discuss today is your third book, which is Making Peace with Death and Dying, a practical guide to, I've forgotten.
Liberating ourselves from the death taboo.
Liberating ourselves from the death taboo. Yes, yes. So, wow, that's quite an interesting title. I mean, we could start with why is death a taboo? And that would just take us down a rabbit hole. But I think I want to go back and start at the beginning. You say on your website that your mom gave you a book of all the world religions when you were just 10 years old. And I'm sure that must have shaped you in some way. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Judith?
Sure. As you were just saying that, one of the things that struck me in my memory was I'm the youngest of three children. And so I usually got hand-me-down books. But that particular book, my mother chose for me. And as I reflect back on who I am and who my brother and sister are, I'm the only one of the three that would have been appropriate for. So my mother was very tuned into me. And when I saw this book, I was raised Catholic. My father was a Lutheran, my mother was Catholic. When they married, they made a bargain. The children will go to public schools through high school and Catholic colleges. So we were exposed to other religions and all, but we were raised Catholic. And so I was used to this myopic view of the world. And that book opened my world, and it was like, oh, I believe that too. Oh, that sounds true to me too. And so it was really, I think, the first thing that woke up that place of resonance inside of me that recognized deep truths from that I knew that I didn't know I knew. So that book, I think, was very pivotal because particularly Taoism and Buddhism were the two that I found the most resonance with.
Fantastic. And then making peace with death and dying. I mean, in our Western society, there's a lot of fear around death. People don't talk about it. I think even in families, if the doctors declared that someone is dying and there's only so much time, I think some families might struggle to even just mention the white elephant in the room. So can you
I
talk
didn't hear the last thing you said.
So even if there's a family and someone has a diagnosis that they will die, I think some families really have a tough time discussing the white elephant in the room. Is that
correct?
True,
Most do. And in fact, I start my book with a statement, and I live in the US, and so the statistics and things I drew on were from my country. And prior to COVID, there were 2.8 million Americans dying each year. That number went up to 3 million with COVID. And so it was a significant increase of the presence of death in our lives. But to me, there's such sadness in the fact that we have been culturally trained to be fearful of death and to avoid death. It's like, we have our arms out in front of us. No, don't come near me. And that has very, very deep roots in our culture. And it's very sad to me. And I know that I mentioned to you that I also function as a chaplain at my hospital. And so I encounter lots of families who are facing the death of a loved one, and they just they don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. You can see that their bodies are ill at ease. And it's very, very sad that we are so ill prepared mentally and emotionally, physically, spiritually for the presence of death, because death is normal. It's it's part of what we sign up for when we get born. I mean, everything that lives dies. And yet we live as though that's a bad thing and that shouldn't happen. So I think that the fear and the resistance to death is a huge problem for us.
I wonder why that is, though. Why is there such almost a blind spot that we will die one day?
Well, a lot of it, in my book, I speak about what I call the 5 deep tap roots of the death taboo. And one of them that strikes me as most powerful was the Black Plague, which was in from 1348 to 1352. Half the European population was wiped out. Now, we only have this minor reflection of that from COVID around the world lately. But notice how prevalent death has become in our lives with COVID. Imagine if half the people that you know died. And so in the consciousness of the people at the time, prior to that, death had been seen as the normal thing that happens. But when the Black Plague came along, people thought it was punishment from God. And so it became a spiritual drama for them, and they became fearful that God would kill them too. And there were a lot of drawings that people made, and they would put them on their clothing and wear them as a way to try and fool death into thinking, oh, I'm already dead, pass over me. Okay. So it was so dominant in the culture, and that fear became rooted in the Western mind. And if you look at how people behave now, in fact, I have this thing that I've been doing as part of my research for this book. I kept Googling the word death and looking at images for about 20 years now. And those pictures from the 1300s are still showing up today as our images of death. And, and images of skulls and crossbones and the Grim Reaper, and all of these images that when you look at them, it's like, I mean, takes your breath away in fear. Yeah. And it's only in the past 5 years or so that the imagery is starting to change, and images that were associated with near-death experiences are now where people are seeing the light, this tunnel of light and things like that are now being kind of counterbalancing that. So there's a shift that's coming. But I wrote this book to bring awareness to how unconscious our fear is.
That's incredible, Judith.
Yeah.
And then you have exercises in this book that people can do. Can you explain a little bit about that, Judith? Why do you have exercises, and how does it help people?
Well, absolutely, because we learn most through doing. Experiential learning stays with us. And so when you read a book, you're reading concepts. And when you're reading concepts, it's up here in your mind. And what I attempt to do in these exercises is to bring personal experience in to ground the learning in the person's own experience. So, for example, an exercise might ask you, what do you think happens when we die? Now, when you're reading about, different people have different beliefs about what happens when we die, and then you go to the next page, that concept is gone. But when I stop you and ask you, what do you think? And how does that change how you behave in relationship to death? Then you engage yourself and activate your awareness of your own relationship with death. And it gives you the opportunity to shift it and alter it.
And maybe you haven't asked yourself that specific question before. And then
Yeah.
you have to explore, well, how do I really feel about this?
And why? Where does that belief come from? Yeah.
So they're
Yeah.
almost like journal prompts. Is that
Yes.
right, Judith?
Yeah. A lot of them are writing prompts.
Okay.
And it's interesting because people say, oh, I don't write. I'm not a journal keeper, yada, yada, yada. But when you're reading a book and you come upon a question, you're more likely to, even if you don't in that moment engage with it, it might get into your brain and have you think. It's like, how do you feel, when you go to visit somebody who's dying in the hospital? Are you aware of how you feel? Are you comfortable? Are you ill at ease? What is most disturbing for you? That kind of thing, to become aware.
Wow, that is tricky, because how do you interact with someone you know is dying, and how do you give them comfort? Because you don't know what they're going through.
Well, there's a few things that I think are important to bear in mind about that. Is, first of all, when somebody you love is in the hospital dying, culturally, a lot of us pretend that that person isn't dying, and we'll go in the room and say, oh, your color looks good today. Now, what that communicates is, I can't deal with this, so don't be real with me. So that's what we really communicate is, I'm not able to handle the fact that you're dying, so I'm in pretend.
And I want you to be okay so I can be okay with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I want you to pretend with me. Don't, and and so it puts a lot of pressure on the dying, to have to manage putting on a smile for the parade of family members who want you to pretend that you're not dying. And I think that this is one of the things that the fear of death does to us is because if you're in fear of what might happen, that takes you out of being present in the moment in your love for the person who's dying. So instead of saying, let's, what can I do for you right now? Would you like the washcloth on your forehead, or can I rub your hand? Or it depends on what stage they're in. But to really work on leave your fear outside the door and come in only with love. It's like, this is the same person you've been loving. It's just that they're coming to the end of their life, and they could use your love at the end as much as any other time. So remember that. Remember that, to stand in your loving.
Oh, that's beautiful, Judith.
Yeah. And I'd like to say a few things about fear, because I don't think people understand how powerful fear is. And when it's fear of death, it's huge. Is like, if you think about, even if it's like, I'm afraid of spiders, or whatever the fear is that somebody has, what fear does physiologically is we go into fight or flight mode. What that means is all the blood flows out of the core into our extremities to prepare us to respond. Okay, fight or flight. But it's important to know what's happening up in the brain as well, because the forebrain is where we think, and thinking is a longer process than reacting. Okay, and so in fight or flight mode, we literally, when we're afraid, we become stupid. Because the blood flow goes to the hindbrain, and we react out of panic. It's like, oh my God, and in that state of reaction, we don't think well, we don't make good decisions. And this is one of the reasons why I'm such a huge advocate of people taking responsibility to do end-of-life planning thoughtfully ahead of time, because otherwise your family members, who are going to be freaked out at the time of your dying, are left making 1,000 decisions without knowing what you wanted. Do you know? So for both things, just to understand, when I'm afraid, I'm not thinking clearly. So one of the most important things about making peace with death is to be aware of the fact, oh, I'm afraid, and understand that a lot of fear is unconscious, but really become as aware as you can of how you feel about death. and work on it, chip away at, well, let me breathe into this. Let me breathe into this experience in this moment.
So Judith, what you're talking about is when someone is dying and everyone knows, and you're suggesting some practical things people can do to become prepared. But what about when it's sudden, when it's totally unexpected? It's a young person you don't expect to die, or it's an accident and someone dies very suddenly. What can people do then when it's just out of the blue? Are there things people can do specifically?
Well, as opposed to being to fear, what happens then is you're in shock. And on one level, shock has a way of comforting us because it makes us numb in the moment. Okay. But coming into the reality of, oh my God, this person is gone. And I know that you know this personally. It's a hugely traumatic experience. Now, one thing to know is only 1 in 10 of us die in a shocking manner like that, all of a sudden. Most people have a gradual decline. But when you have a shock like that, it's super important to pay attention to caring for yourself and being aware of how you're doing and taking care of your needs, making sure that you are okay. All right. Like one of the things that I'm an advocate about is that businesses need to allow more flexibility for people to have time to grieve and not to expect people to get back at the job. In the States, the average time off from work for a primary family member's death is 4 days. So in a way, the society is saying to us, get over it. Well, you don't get over it. When somebody who is an essential part of your life all of a sudden is gone, not only do you have 1,000 details to tend to and the ceremonies and things like that, but the practicalities and all, but emotionally dealing with, that person is gone. My mother died in 2006. And to this day, there are times when inside my mind is like, oh, I have to, and then I'll stop myself because I was about to say, I have to ask my mother or tell my mother this or that. And then it's like this other part of me reminds me she's no longer here, so it's also has to do with how visually oriented we are. And so the absence of somebody's physical presence is huge. It's an enormous thing. And when you are in a society that does not know how to comfort us, well, we don't have the sources of comfort surrounding us at that time. It's very, very hard.
We don't have the support that we need.
Yeah. Yeah.
Purely because people have no idea what to do or how to be supportive because it's not part of our culture.
No.
So Judith, if someone bought this book, would it help people to comfort people who are grieving too? Would it give them those tools? Okay.
Yeah. Let me say a little bit about the book. That the book is designed, first of all, to educate people about what I mean about the death taboo, and what is it, and is it really a thing? And absolutely it is. And that we do most of us live in tremendous fear of death, and that is a learned response. And so most of the book deals with how to unlearn that response and to learn how to be comfortable and present in our loving for each other, whether you are somebody who's just had, let's say, a terminal diagnosis, or a loved one is dying, or you get a phone call that somebody's, dying or something. The book deals with all these practicalities of how to deal emotionally, and to tap into what your spiritual beliefs are, and how to make death a more normal part of the process of life and death. Because as a chaplain at the hospital, for example, I notice how many times families are faced with a family member who is a distance away and they can't get away. It's like we don't make it a priority to come and be with the loved one. We have lots of reasons and excuses, and we're so plugged into our life. It's hard. It's hard because we have also abstracted death out of our daily life through things like the institutionalization of people who are sick, the institutionalization of the elderly. And so they're out of our homes. They used to be in our homes, intergenerational homes. Now they're not part of our everyday life. And so our everyday life, so to speak, is in competition with their needs rather than their needs being an essential part of our daily lives.
That is very, very true. And how did you come to this knowledge? How did you come to write your book, Judith? What happened to you personally?
What happened to me? I refer to it as baptism by fire. My mother and I were very dear friends. We shared a home the last 9 years of her life. And 6 months before she died, she fell backwards down some stairs, cracked her head open. And that moment changed my life because I went from sharing a home with my dear mother and the routines that we had to not knowing if she was alive or dead because there was this awful crack and then this silence. And, it was an extraordinary experience. And my mother was a registered nurse. And so that part of her, thank God, took charge. Even, I didn't know if she was even alive when I reached her at the bottom of the stairs. And she immediately, and her, this may be too graphic, but I'm going to share it anyway, because things happen. The blood was coming out of her head at the rhythm of her pulse and out of her elbow, where these were the two places that hit. And so she had said, put one hand on my head, one on my elbow, and call the emergency medical people. And of course, two hands, it was hard. Elevate my head. So she guided me to those things. And I think it was 14 minutes that I just held her and prayed. And then all of a sudden, this swarm of people came in and took charge and pushed me away and swept her off to the hospital. And I met her there. And that was the beginning of 6 months. And luckily, we had much of that time. We had hospice care. And I'm so grateful to the doctor who, an emergency room doctor who, after about our 5th visit to the emergency room in that time, took me aside and he said, there's really nothing further that we can do medically for your mother. And it's time to recognize that she's at the end of her life. He was direct, and I was so grateful because people, even doctors, have such a hard time with this. Because a lot of doctors will not tell you that because they perceive making that statement as a personal failure. It's like, what's wrong with me with all these bells and whistles of technology that I can't fix this person? Well, she was 89 years old. She'd fallen down some stairs, And so I was very grateful because he was the one who introduced the idea of hospice. So how I wrote the book came about because on my mother's deathbed, she grabbed my arm and she looked in my eyes and she said, promise me that you will write about what we have learned about dying in a world that doesn't know how to do death. And so it took me 15 years. The book took 5 different forms before I finally found it. And, it's such a sense of completion to have fulfilled my promise to her. But also the purpose of it was to help others to be more knowledgeable and to not have to go through some of the things we went through that had we been more knowledgeable, we wouldn't have had to face. So it was really an act of love.
And a gift, a tremendous gift.
Yeah.
That you are giving to the world, Jesus. Okay, and speaking of gifts, I believe you have a free gift for our audience.
I do. I do. I have a piece that I wrote that is about it's the 10 best things to do for a loved one who's dying. And so that's available on it's on the link is for you. And again, it's to give you a quick look at how can I be more effective when I'm in that situation. So I hope it helps you all.
Okay, so if you're interested in Judith's gift, the link will be on this email that you're watching the video
Yes.
on. So
Yes.
just look below. Okay, Judith, that's an incredible story about your mom and service, and I'm actually very intrigued to read your book, I have to say. Okay, so is there anything you'd like to share with the audience? Something I haven't asked you, or some wisdom
Yes.
you'd like to leave them with?
Yeah. Yeah. And that is that if you go to the dictionary and you look up the word death, it defines death as basically the stopping of our physiological functions. And I think it's so important to explore, is that what you think? Who do you think you are? Do you think that you are just the body and the personality, or do you believe that there's a spiritual dimension to your being? Because for those of us who believe in the spiritual dimension of our being, the death of the physical body is not as big a deal as it is for those who believe that that's all there is. And so it's something important to think about, what your beliefs are in that area. Because I know for myself, it's a great comfort. It's a great comfort to know that I perceive myself to be a soul who's having a human experience. And this lifetime, I'm here as Judith Johnson. And I'm doing, this is my vehicle of learning and growing spiritually. And I am a soul who's going to continue on. And it's a very different experience than for those who perceive themselves only in physical form.
And that this is their only life, and when it's
Yeah.
over, it's over.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure this is in your book too, to get people to think about, well, who am I? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And also to realize that when you make peace with death, you do two things about how you live your life. Life becomes much more precious to you, and you get to live it in a more relaxed way, because fear operates, a lot of it is unconscious. You don't even have a clue all the ways that it's affecting how you're behaving. Things like the fountain of youth. Oh, let me get another cream to cover up my crow's feet by my eyes, or whatever. And all the ways that we avoid aging and dying. And when we relax into the normalcy of the whole cycle of life and death, life becomes more precious, because we know we do have an expiration date. And it becomes a much softer journey when we do not live in fear.
Wow, that's very wise, Judith. So thank you so much for your time and sharing your wisdom and your beautiful free gift with us, Judith.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So to everybody, just keep tuned. There is another very exciting episode in From Mourning to Light coming to you. Keep looking out for it in your inboxes, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.